Let's be brutally honest right now. That's a big question.
I'm looking for someone who doesn't want to go to base camp, but they want to go to the very top.
Whether it's here, India, New York.
Civilization was born at happy hour.
That's what wins. That's what stands out. That's what people are interested in. That's what I want to know. The Hospopreneurs Podcast with James Henderson. Hello and welcome to episode 96 of the Hospopreneurs Podcast. Seedlip and Starward Whiskey are two of the companies Frank Lampen has scaled through his business, Distill Ventures. The 6-year-old beverage accelerator has invested in another 8 brands globally at various stages of development. Prior to working with startups, Frank held operational roles across the hospitality, music and media industries, and consequently draws on an incredible and wide body of knowledge. I couldn't be more proud to have Frank on the program. He was truly and deeply insightful. Unfortunately, soon after starting the interview, my microphone cut recording, but we did run a backup, so it's tinny, but it does the trick to hear our conversation together. Hello and welcome to the show, Frank.
Hi, thanks. Great to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you on. I'm very excited to hear more about your story and about Distill Ventures. So, Frank, what is your most memorable hospitality experience?
I think one of the things that made the biggest impression on me actually happened pretty early. So my father's cousin owned a country house hotel in the UK called Summer Lodge Hotel. And I used to spend some of my school holidays going and working there. And my cousin Nigel Corbett and his wife Margaret, they were just really excellent hosts. And I think in my first couple of days there, so many things made a really big impression on me. So one of the things the hotel, it was quite a small hotel, did was they regarded it as a failure if you had to refer to someone as sir or madam, because we wanted people to feel like they were guests in a country house, not that they checked into a hotel. And so every morning you would get the sheet of who was staying with. And this was going back some years ago, so this wasn't computerized. There's all these index card files and you'd get a sheet of everyone who was staying, had they stayed before, what were their favorite drinks, what did they tend to drink before dinner, drink after dinner. And you had to memorize this because you wanted, when people came in, to sort of try and guess who they were and address them by name first and be able to kind of offer them what they normally had or be open if they wanted to try something different. And this made a really big impression on me because I'd always, I guess, when I'd gone out to restaurants and so on, I thought it was quite fancy being referred to as sir. But I think that flip of him making me realize kind of how impersonal that was and wanting to provide a very personal experience was sort of really important. And something which, again, made a big impression to me is I remember it might have been on the second day, I went and found him in the office and I said, oh, there's a man here asking me. And he just stopped me and said, not a man, a gentleman. And I think that thing as well about that you want to treat everyone, whether that was a guest arriving, whether that was a tradesman arriving, that you wanted to treat everyone with their sort of ultimate respect, but do it in a very personal way. That made a really big impression on me. And it's something that certainly when I used to work in bars and restaurants, I used to take into account. But even now, I try and think back to that spirit of giving people that great sort of very personal experience and respecting everyone as being sort of a really fundamental part of what hospitality is.
When you do think about it now, how has that influenced the way that you do things now? How does that look practically in your work?
Yeah, I think at Distill Ventures, we work with about 20 or so companies around the world who are starting new drinks brands, and they're all founder-led businesses, in some cases single founder, in some cases married couples, in some cases 2 or 3 founders. We help them get investment in their business, but then become a partner for them really in the business to kind of help them in whatever way is going to be most beneficial for them. And we try and make that a really bespoke, tailored set of support. We try and make it sort of really focused on that particular founder and what's going to drive their business in the best kind of possible way. But within doing that, it's not just a purely professional exercise. I think anyone who's sort of founded a business knows that it's a very personal, emotional journey and lots of highs and lows and lots of things at stake for people. And so you can't just do that in an impersonal consulting sort of way. It is a very personal journey and a very personal relationship you have with them. So I think with all of the founders we work with, obviously we don't want to interrupt their privacy if they don't want to. And some people like to maintain some boundaries between work life and professional life. But actually, in most cases, with the kind of founders that we work with, we know them, we know their partners, we know their children's names. Being really sort of showing you really interested in them as a person and their personal journey is very important to us in what we do.
Fantastic. You mentioned there in the answer that you're looking for bespoke opportunities with those individuals. What are some common things that most founders require?
It really does vary. I think in some cases, what you're trying to do is sort of help the founder build a team around them. And that that team, depending on what they're trying to do in the business, are they a whiskey business in the early stages where actually they haven't got much whiskey and it's going to be several years before they have a lot of whiskey, in which case the support might be much more around operations and distilling and long range sort of financial planning, so you can get that balance of how much do I produce now and the cash that's going to take, to ensure I've got enough later, but not sort of overproduce and need to take on too much capital. In other cases where a brand is aggressively trying to take a new market opportunity in several countries around the world, it's going to be much more around commercial and marketing support. And so you're trying to help the founders sort of build a brilliant team for that, and you try and help them identify, according to what stage they're in, which of those roles they need to have within the core team and at what level, and then which of those roles might they be able to fill either through support from us or from other sort of consultants. And so right at the heart of it is, how can we help the founder build an excellent team to make this project happen? And what that team looks like is going to be very different. It's very bespoke in each individual case. So that's about sort of understanding the business need, understanding the kind of capabilities of the people already there, understanding the capacity of their capacity to learn and grow. That you have to work out that there are some things which they, with the right support, they could get really good at, and there are probably some things that they're never going to be good at. And so that's a case of sort of finding someone that they can have a deep trust relationship with to kind of do that role within the business.
Yes. What sort of models do you use to assess the requirements of founders?
Model makes it sort of sound as though there's there is a sort of kind of formula to it. I think it's a combination of things. I think one of the most important things is having multiple people from my team meet them, because I think that's where you kind of get to a really good assessment, is if 2 or 3 people meet them, and then you can kind of share what your experience is of them, because that brings the different perspectives and experience from my team to bear in different conversations with the person to see how they respond. So that's a really important part of it. I think you're always sort of interested in how curious do they ask a lot of questions, and when they ask those questions of you, and you perhaps sort of kind of share some insider experience you might have kind of gained from around the world, how do they sort of respond to that? So you're looking for people who are curious. We need people who have got sort of very strong opinions and strong visions, but who are open to kind of having those kind of challenged and having their view of the world kind of challenged based on sort of new information or a new perspective. And so you're looking for that sort of kind of sense of smart, curious, opinionated, but actually they want to engage in debate about things because they want to surround themselves with other sort of kind of smart, opinionated people with knowledge, because when you start putting that together, that's where the sort of magic happens, really. So you're looking at that, and obviously you're trying to sort of assess what their broad skills are across the sort of business, and it doesn't mean that they have to be kind of excellent at financial planning, but you want to understand whether they think about the numbers. Are they sort of someone who's sort of kind of naturally on top of that stuff, or is that somewhere where they're going to need support? And if they are going to need support there, do they realize that? So you're looking at, have they got that sort of kind of self-knowledge around areas they're good at and not good at? That's really important. One of the maxims I always think of is the only thing you need to know is what you don't know, because if you know what you don't know and what you're not good at, you can kind of then go and find sort of someone to sort of fill that gap. So I think self-knowledge is really important. So you're looking at sort of, have they got that sort of self-knowledge about where they're going to need help and support within the business, and are they able to sort of take that sort of big picture view, what it's going to take to make this sort of successful? Are they able to kind of combine that with understanding the detail of their own business? You're looking for all of those sort of ability to go really big picture view down to detail and back up again. Those are sort of some of the things that when you sort of see someone who's got that sort of ability, you think, yeah, that's probably got sort of some of the key ingredients for success there.
Frank, I love where we've gone so far. I just want to reel it back just a little bit to a question I like to ask a little bit earlier in the episode, is why you do what you do. So on a really macro, big picture level, why do you do what you do?
I do what I do because food and drink's a passion. I am interested in things which are kind of small and growing rather than things which are already big. So I'm interested in people who are trying to do something new and different. And so the opportunity to sort of work in that area that I'm really passionate about, of food and drink, and to do that with people who are trying to do something new is, hits a lot of buttons for me. So yeah, that in essence is why I do it.
Love that. What is it about growing something that's smaller, or helping something that's smaller grow? What is it about that gives you more satisfaction than helping a larger business build?
I think because I mean, any kind of sales and marketing of any kind of product, it's all about sort of trying to understand the market and see where the market opportunity might be, and then build a way of accessing that market opportunity. I just think that the scale and stage at which you're doing that makes that task kind of very different from one which, when you're doing stuff at really big scale, it's a lot of data analysis, it's a lot of market segmentation, and then it's sort of looking at lots of levers like price and value chain and so on. And there are obviously a lot of people who love having that sort of kind of big impact and sort of seeing spreadsheets with kind of millions and tens of millions on, and that's what really motivates them, and they're really good at doing that. I think when you're doing it at small scale, a lot of it is much more based around hunch and intuition. If you're doing something new, by definition, there may not be the data kind of showing it's going to be possible. As you start getting to market, you need to be smart and understand the market. You need to look at other people's pricing. You need to look at what's happening in the market, but you're still having to, I think, kind of take more risks based on not just sort of looking at market data, but also kind of looking at hunches around consumer trends and, what's happening in the zeitgeist, what's happening in culture, how are attitudes to food and drink changing through where people are going on holiday, or what the latest waves of migration might look like. All of those sort of kind of cultural factors kind of come into play as well, where you're sort of trying to sort of get a sense of where things are going and trying to act against sort of what some of those hunches might be kind of telling you about where there's opportunity. So I think it's just that although in essence the task might be the same, the kind of tools you use for it are very different when you're doing it at small scale and doing innovative things.
Yes. How do you know when another resource is required? I mean, maybe a human resource. As you're building businesses with founders, how do you assess when, say, someone else needs to come in and start running things, or if the founder has a sufficient ability to continue to build the business, build it forward into the larger entity?
Well, you don't always kind of have perfect foresight on that. I mean, let's start by acknowledging the reality in that sometimes that has to be reactive, right? Sometimes it's kind of, well, actually, we've had a few problems over the last few months. Maybe cash flow got a bit tight. Maybe we discovered that our forecasting was kind of wildly off because we weren't sort of properly sort of risk adjusting for things outside of our control. And so maybe we've identified that there's a bit of a kind of gap in the business here, and should we kind of plug that gap? So the honest answer is it's often reactive. I think best case scenario in terms of it being proactive is you're looking at the plan for the next year and you really sort of kind of think hard about what it's going to take to deliver that plan. And you do the risk assessment of where could it go wrong? And it may be that we're sort of opening up new markets and new channels. And for instance, if you're a drinks brand and you spent the first year really sort of hand selling into high-end cocktail bars, that's all about personal relationships. Your commercials have to work. No one's going to put a sort of $100 product in a cocktail apart from, maybe one or two sort of 5-star hotel bars. But, so you've got to have your commercials right. But fundamentally, a lot of it is based around relationships and being seen in the right places. And if a couple of years later you're going into Dan Murphy's, you're going into vintage cellars, then that's going to be a very different type of sale because, they're probably attracted by the fact you've got this great profile, but they are going to want to talk about promotional periods and they're going to want to talk about what your joint business plan is with them. And that's a very different set of skills. So part of it is you're just looking at the sort of sales mix and are we going into channels where the type of sale we'll be doing is done in a very different way? And have we got the kind of skills to do that within the business? And then part of it, you're looking from a sort of operational perspective about how much more complex is the business going to get? And is the current team got sufficient kind of capacity to manage that complexity? Or do we think that there's new skills going to be needed? And then in some cases, you're just sort of kind of thinking around, well, is the sort of fundamental nature of the business changing? Is it moving from a period where maybe the sort of predominant focus on the business was around operations and manufacturing and distilling to a point where it's about being a really kind of consumer-led company and sales and marketing being the kind of focus. And I think quite a few of the whiskey companies we work with go through a bit of that transition because the first years is all about setting up a distillery, the incredibly difficult job of raising enough money to sort of lay down stock when you can't sell any whiskey, and because it's not whiskey yet, it's got to sit in a barrel for 3 years and you've got no revenue. That's a kind of particular type of kind of challenge. But then, if that goes well and you raise some money and you lay down some whiskey, then you sort of see this point, you're looking at your future whiskey availability and you sort of say, oh, well, I can see a point when we're going to go from maybe 10 to 20,000 bottles available each year to maybe 100,000 bottles available each year, and then maybe 300,000 bottles available each year. And, we're going to need to think about sales and marketing very differently as that happens. And the whole culture of the company is going to need to shift. And so do we think that the company is well set to kind of make that shift? And does that require sort of bringing in some new people to do that. So it's at its best, you're doing it looking forward sort of several years like that, which is often the case in whiskey companies because you sort of see the future stock availability. But, as we said at the start, in some cases, unfortunately, foresight's not perfect. So it ends up being kind of reactive where you kind of see about, well, where's the company maybe sort of had some struggles this year or some things which may have kind of come close to sort of going wrong, and how can we avoid that happening in the future?
Yes. There were two things in there that I'd like to ask you questions about. So the first is that you mentioned, obviously, it's about having those personal relationships, building relationships with people, and being seen in the right places. The question I have is, how have those right places changed over your time in the industry?
Yeah. I mean, I think the thing about the spirits industry is your kind of market where you sell it is incredibly dispersed. I mean, Australia's a little bit kind of unique in this regard in that obviously retail is, has these two really big players of, they keep changing their name, but I think currently Endeavour Drinks Group, Dan Murphy's and BWS on the one side, and then Coles with Vintage Cellars and Liquorland on the other. So you've got two big customers there, which obviously can access a big part of the retail market. But even if you look then at what we would call the on-premise, so bars and restaurants, and hotels, there are some groups there, but actually a lot of that is businesses where, someone might own a couple of outlets, but a lot of them are places where someone just owns a single outlet. So in Australia is probably one of the slightly more concentrated markets. I think if you go to a market like Spain, you're dealing with tens of thousands of really small bars and restaurants, most of which are sort of family owned and operated. And so you have this sort of kind of very dispersed market. And that's one of the sort of unique things around spirits compared to, say, most groceries where, groceries tend to kind of go through the kind of larger chains. I think what's kind of changing is that there's a sense that the way you can access that very dispersed market is you go to very influential places and they tend to kind of get watched by the next tier down and get this trickle down effect. And I think there is some evidence of that, certainly. In some ways that influence has been heightened because the reach of those influential places through things like Instagram, I think, has got a lot stronger in that a lot of people will kind of follow, whether they're in the industry or just sort of keen consumers, will follow sort of chefs and bartenders and see what they're posting around. But I think you've had some other forces happening as well, which have sort of kind of changed the mix a little bit. And one of them is the rise of online. So I think particularly in spirits and particularly in whiskey, we see in a lot of markets in Europe where the online channel is becoming super important, because if you're lucky enough to live near a great whiskey specialist retailer who does lots of tastings and normally has sort of 3 or 4 bottles open and helps you try new things and discover new things, that's great. But the reality is that was probably a small number of people in large cities who had that luxury, and there was an awful lot of people who were just being not very well served because they weren't near one of those kind of shops. And that's actually fantastic for those people in terms of being able to purchase a much wider range of whiskies. And some of those retailers have done really smart things like offering tasting samples or putting on their own events. So maybe you can kind of come to a sort of festival sort of once a year and you can kind of taste 30 things and sort of make your little kind of hit list of stuff you might order through the year and so on. So I think online has been the biggest sort of significant change, where I think that using your own social media as a whiskey distillery, going to lots of events and shows, meeting a lot of people, and then having your product available through online channels has become a really important way of growing a whiskey business. And that's a sort of big change, I think, over the last few years.
What's the sort of process that founders go through to raise capital? We've talked a bit about this on the program before, but from your perspective, how do people go through that process?
Yeah, it depends on the stage you're at, I think. I think if you're early stage and looking for kind of proof of concept, then, obviously different countries have different restrictions. But I think in the early stages, I think friends and family or the more sort of retail investor that you can access through things like crowdfunding are a viable route. And I think crowdfunding has really sort of developed. And I think the opportunity it gives you to test a bit of kind of reaction to your product and raise a bit of money at the same time. And maybe the people who invest become real sort of ambassadors for it. I think that can be really interesting. But realistically, I think that's a sort of right to maybe raise kind of tens of thousands of dollars, maybe if you're lucky, sort of low hundreds of thousands of dollars, which maybe gets you a product, it gets you a kind of proof of concept. I think beyond that, then you need to look in different places. So if you want to, certainly if you're a whiskey business, you need to sort of think about raising millions of dollars, probably in very, very kind of broad terms, not only sort of building a distillery, but you probably want to be investing $1 million a year in laying down whiskey before you've even sold any, if you want to do it at any sort of serious scale, and the figures can kind of rise from that sort of very quickly. And even if you're not a whiskey brand, I think if you want to be tackling 2 or 3 markets outside of Australia, you've got a couple of routes to do that. You could either do a sort of low investment route where you try and find some really good importers in different markets, and you're selling to them, so you're generating some cash. But the reality is that that might bring in a bit of cash. It might get you presence in a kind of few bars, but it's probably not going to start building real scale if you're not in a position to invest in marketing and brand building in those export markets. And if you start doing that in 2 or 3 markets outside of your home market, again, I think you're looking at needing kind of millions of dollars a year for a few years to fund that. Now, there are exceptions. There are some really standout businesses in our industry who've managed to kind of catch a wave and fund a lot of their growth off their own cash flow, relatively small initial investment and then throwing off enough kind of cash to fund a lot of their own growth. But they are the black swans, if you like. They are the exceptions. And the reality is that most businesses that build any sort of sizable international footprint will have raised millions of dollars to do that. And if you want to really tackle the US market, then you're probably edging closer to tens of millions of dollars in terms of what you need to raise finance-wise. So at those levels, I think that kind of puts you beyond that sort of kind of crowdfunding market. And I think what you really need to look is an investor who understands sort of the journey and understands what the kind of needs are going to be and has the appetite to kind of keep on following on their sort of kind of money, potentially still kind of funding things kind of quite close up into a point where there might be an exit event, because it is growing a brand in our industry is an expensive business. And so I think it's sort of being able to take the perspective where you can kind of think not just about this kind of next funding round, but can I find people who are good for maybe 3 or 4 funding rounds over the next sort of 3 or 4 years is really important, because you don't want to be starting that process from scratch each time with a kind of different group of investors, because the first ones you went to maybe had the kind of capacity for that kind of first round of funding, but didn't have the capacity to kind of keep following on thereafter. That's just going to kill you in terms of that's going to take majority of your kind of time. And, there are some people who love the fundraising thing, and great, well and good, and they can kind of go out and do that. But the reality is most people, they didn't start a drinks business to spend their time kind of going around talking to investors. And so trying to find people who can kind of fund you for the journey, I think, is the sort of best advice I can give anyone.
And on that journey, so obviously this is a massive part of scaling up a business. Have the channels changed, and what channels are you finding are the most effective for people to be looking for investment today?
And I think that the challenge today is almost kind of which channels you say no to, because we're in an era of very low interest rates. And that obviously means there's a lot more money available for kind of equity and venture financing and debt financing, which is more the sort of kind of venture stage of debt. And there's a lot of money looking for a home and looking for a return. So I think the biggest challenge today is actually who you say no to, because I think it is really important that you do find people, as we just mentioned, who really sort of kind of understand what trajectory is going to be and are sort of there for the kind of long term. I think the worst thing for me is we get sent quite a lot of business plans across a range of things. And I've got to say, anyone listening to this whose investment strategy is to kind of find people on LinkedIn and cold email them on LinkedIn to ask them about investment, I think you just got to kind of stop and reconsider your approach. To be honest, like I barely go on LinkedIn just because it's so spammy. Occasionally I have to kind of go on and get bombarded with these things of people who, they've looked at maybe sort of something I did like 13 years ago and therefore think that, an expert in their sector and want to invest in their kind of business. So you get sent quite a lot of stuff. I tend not to look at the LinkedIn stuff, but some people are smart and they find out my email address and email me and things. And the worst thing for me is when you get those kind of business plans that have those kind of 2 or 3 set pages of stats they've kind of pulled from Google about how this is going to be an X billion dollar opportunity and it's doing this growth rate and stuff. Because I kind of think that if you're putting in that sort of general category fluff at the beginning, it suggests you're sending this to people who don't really know about that category. And, I think it would be much better for you to find people who really understand the category, who are not going to be impressed by some stats that you've managed to kind of Google or, some market research report that you've managed to get a hold of, but who really understand your industry, because a good investment pitch is going to spend much more time focusing on why this group of people and this product and proposition is going to be able to access that opportunity than it is on sort of selling the opportunity in the first place.
Yes. On that note, when you're assessing the viability of these investments, what metrics do you use to determine if you should go ahead with something?
A team is the most important, because I think we do fall into that category, hopefully, of being what we just talked about being sort of specialists in the industry. I think we're pretty quickly able to understand the economics of a business and its supply chain, and it doesn't mean that has to be perfect when we invest, but it's just about sort of looking at this product and its pack and any kind of key ingredients and us looking at that sort of saying, inherently, is there any any reason why this value chain can't be optimized over time to something that's going to work. So you do a kind of quick sense check of that, which in most cases we're able to do kind of pretty quickly. And then it really is around the kind of team. Do we think that this team has got a clear vision of the opportunity they're going after? And are they either capable of executing against that opportunity right now, or have they shown the kind of capacity to grow and bring new people in and be able to kind of build a team to go after different opportunities? So team is the most fundamental thing we're looking at, really. And because you're hoping that through that, if it's a good team, they will have identified any sort of particular structural challenges in what they're trying to do. For instance, is there one big dominant global brand in that category who spends heavily to defend their listings? And if so, what is your strategy to get around that? If you're picking a good team, they probably will have done a lot of the diligence on the opportunity themselves and around, done the analysis of the opportunities and the threats themselves, rather than you having to kind of do that. If you're doing a sort of SWOT analysis and spotting things that they've never considered, that should be a red flag.
To build on this further, before I move on to another question, I'd like to know more specifically with regards to the drinks industry, how does it differ from other, fields or industries that people invest in?
I think one of the structural differences of the drinks industry is relatively small number of global companies in the industry. So if you look at a kind of global level, there's some listed companies, there's some family-owned companies, there's some sort of strong regional players who are sort of building more of an international business. But it's a relatively small number of companies compared to other sectors of food and drink. And so there is this kind of a concentration compared to some other sectors of food and drink. And that does kind of create some challenges for people who are outside the industry, in that long term, I think if you have got an ambition to grow something into a kind of global brand, you are looking at somewhere between 10 and 20 kind of companies that might be the sort of eventual home for a kind of global brand, because it's kind of hard to be one single global brand in isolation, because the cost of what you need to invest in your route to market for one single brand probably doesn't really sort of make sense versus being part of a sort of kind of family of brands. So that degree to which in the drinks industry there are not quite the sort of same number of potential acquirers as there are in the food industry, I think is one of the kind of key differentiating kind of characteristics of it, really. And so I think what that means is that historically there's been a bit less range of activity and investment activity in the drinks industry than there has in the food space. I think that's kind of changed recently because it is an industry which has attractive margins. And as I think there's been this sort of kind of big challenge in the food retailing sector with the rise of sort of discounters and the kind of challenge to those traditional kind of grocery route to market, obviously margins have come under pressure, and the drinks industry does still offer kind of quite attractive margins. And so I think you are getting a kind of wider variety of people kind of coming in, starting up new things at the moment, and how that will kind of translate to how the industry transforms over time, we will have to kind of wait and see. But certainly, there's a lot of new ideas and new people and new money kind of coming into sort of setting things up. So we've seen this huge boom in the number of whiskey distilleries being founded globally. Obviously, we're the high point, whether it's a peak or not, I don't know, but we're certainly at a high point in terms of the number of gin brands globally. So a lot of new players have sort of kind of come in, and that has kind of shaken things up a little bit. And I guess business that a lot of us are in are seeing which of those new brands that have started up can become global brands in the future.
On the note of having a smaller number of players in the market, does that make it more challenging to make it at the top end, or is it a matter of attracting adjacent industries to be looking at the drinks industry?
Well, I think it's a case of how much diversity will we kind of see over the long term. You should always sort of start with looking at how is the consumer changing and how is the sort of way in which we discover and buy and enjoy things kind of changing. You've got to start with the consumer change. And so I think there is this real desire for discovery and exploring new things and discovering new products all the time amongst consumers. I think we're much more open to that sort of diversity of flavors, ingredients, that kind of curiosity about things which might come from places which don't traditionally have a kind of heritage of producing that product. Well, what are they going to bring to, making whiskey that hasn't been sort of done previously? So I think you start with the perspective of diversity from the consumer perspective, and then you kind of think, well, will that diversity in consumer taste kind of follow through into the industry? And that's where you look at the retail channels, and that's where I think things like online do have a massive impact, because it just makes it possible for you to discover and enjoy and purchase a much broader selection of products. Fashionably, we would all kind of talk about that sort of long tail effect a few years ago. That certainly you can see that now in terms of being able to kind of access a much sort of broader variety of brands and product than you could kind of previously. And I think that sort of changes even at the bar and on-premise level as well. There's kind of quite a lot of countries now have got really great online wholesale solutions for bars, in that there's always been places where you turn up sort of somewhere and you go into a whiskey bar and they've got this amazing selection and you can, how have you got all of this? And it turns out that they're going and bringing stuff back in suitcases, or they've got regulars who, when they kind of travel, are sort of bringing stuff back in and so on. And, you always had a few outliers like that. But actually, I think it's becoming more common now that you can go to a reasonably sized city and find a whiskey bar which has got an amazing selection. And when you ask them now about how you're doing it, you're saying, oh, well, there's this guy who set up an online wholesaler where I just kind of I can order single bottles of some unique whiskey. He's importing them and he's not driving vans or anything like that. He's sending them out with FedEx or DHL or whatever. That sort of diversity of choice, I think, is spilling from just the consumer buying stuff to drink at home to bars being able to access a broader range of stuff through some online wholesalers as well. So you think that diversity should kind of continue in that space. The big question is, how far does that diversity go? Does it kind of continue? And if we look at the industry in 10 years' time and think, well, what are the big brands? Is that going to look very, very different from how it used to do? I mean, I think there's always been kind of change in the industry. And the question is, will the next wave of change, is that just going to be about sort of replacing one big brand with another big brand, or is it going to be about a diversity story? I think vodka, if you look at it, that you get these sort of waves in vodka. Smirnoff was huge and I think still probably one of the biggest selling vodkas globally. But then there was obviously a period then where Absolute sort of became the big brand and Absolute was everywhere. And then you've got a moment now where Tito's is kind of big player in vodka. And so the question is does that cycle continue in the case of what will be the next Tito's and the next big dominant brand, or will it change in the sense of maybe we won't get those sort of really big dominant brands again in the future? It will be a much more diversified selection. How that plays out, I think, is the big kind of question for this industry, as it is for many industries.
That effect is taking place much, much more broadly with these micro brands where anyone can launch their own product, anyone can be a business, these micro influencers even around the world. I guess that does translate a lot more broadly so that paradox of choice does take place. There was a book by Barry Schwartz called The Paradox of Choice. One of the concepts in this book is that actually having that overwhelming level of choice not just confuses people, but makes us less happy. So there are some other complications that could potentially come about from having too many options. What sort of effect is that having currently, because we can speculate on the future, but what sort of effect is that having currently on brands, and how are they adapting to that increased level of competition?
I think in general, if you look at categories like gin and whiskey, I think there's a large number of people who've embraced having that greater choice. I think there are some challenges in the sense of, just because something's kind of new and from a small producer doesn't mean it's going to be any good. And so I think there is a kind of challenge in that, some of the small brands that come to the market are just not very good products, honestly. And at a point where it becomes sort of very easy to kind of launch something and people are looking for something new, unfortunately, it becomes easy to launch things which aren't very good. So I think there's certainly a kind of challenge in that those waves of innovation, often led by pioneers who do amazing things, but you get a lot of kind of fast followers, some of whom don't produce very good products. So that can be a bit of a challenge when someone pays $65 for a bottle of gin and they taste it and it's just like, this is actually just not a very nice gin. I think there's certainly, in that case, I think given that small producers often have to price at slightly high prices, I think there is a risk for the quote unquote craft independent part of the industry that if products come through which don't really justify the slightly high price tags that those products tend to have, that might put people off and they'll kind of go back to kind of what they know, because there are some big established brands who've been around for a long time who offer fantastic kind of value for money and are very reliable. So I think there's definitely a bit of an element of that. And it's really interesting in that gin boom that everyone benefited out of the gin boom. It wasn't a case that was small brands benefiting at the expense of big brands. So like everyone was growing within that. So it's not necessarily a zero-sum game. And it'll be interesting now with a lot more small whiskey brands coming to market as well. A lot of them at really high price points. I think some of them, frankly, have got the value exchange wrong in the sense of they price by the fact that it's kind of very scarce and, put $150 price tag on it. And actually the quality of the liquid just doesn't really justify that. So that's where you do rely on having really good retailers, whether that's an online retailer or whether that's a whiskey bar or whether that's a specialist smallest whiskey shop, you rely on retailers. That's part of the function of the retail part of the industry, both on premise and off premises, to help make those sort of selections and pick out the things where that sort of price value equation is really good and help people discover those things. So we need a sort of really strong, vibrant retail industry that can continue to perform that function and help people discover great stuff at a good price and sort of weed out the things which are maybe sort of trying to ride a bandwagon and, overpricing not very good liquid.
Yes, that value component is major in that equation. And to tie it back to a little bit earlier in the question there, that potentially the factor that's pushing back on having more and more competition is the fact that people want to go with brands that they trust, and that ultimately means good liquid, a good product at a good price. So that makes total sense, hearing your logic around that as well. So thank you very much for your insights there. Frank, I'd love to know what you are learning about or exploring at the moment.
At the moment, I'm several years into this exploration, but a really big focus for us is the US market and helping brands succeed in that US market. And that's a combination of brands which are based in the US. We're helping them grow business in the US, plus brands like Starward from Melbourne, which is selling in quite a number of places throughout the US at the moment. And the US has some pretty unique features to it. Legacy of history and prohibition is that there was a pretty unique structure put in the industry when prohibition was repealed, which makes it quite kind of different from how it is in other markets. And so you have to really adapt your strategies and how you go to market in the US to succeed. You have to be sort of really focused about which bit of the market you want to go after, because it's so sort of big and vast. We've been really sort of committing ourselves over the last few years, helping our companies kind of access that US market opportunity. But it's a multi-year journey. I think we've made some good progress, and it's great to see brands like Starward getting a lot of interest in the US. But every day we apply ourselves to getting better and better at understanding that market and helping our companies access it.
Yes, and for listeners as well, if you're interested, David Vitale, the founder of Starward, was on an earlier episode as well. So swing on back to that episode if you want to check it out. Frank, if someone wants to do what you do, what advice do you have for them?
We obviously get people reaching out to us quite a lot, wanting to do it. I think the kind of key thing is that most of our team, particularly kind of at the senior levels of our team, they have some pretty deep experience. And that experience is usually either having worked on their own business or having worked really closely in a founder-led business. And I think that for us, because it is about that really close partnership with the founders and being really sensitive to what they need really and what type of person they are and what you can do to help their success, that very kind of personal bespoke experience that we talked about at the start of the conversation. I think that it's not to say that you have to have done it to have that sensitivity, but it sure as hell helps if you have run a business yourself or you've been very close to kind of running a business, that you do understand the realities of it. And so most of the senior people in our team have got that kind of direct experience. So I think we do get younger people kind of coming to us sort of saying, I really want to work in the industry. I want to work in investment. I want to sort of mentor founders. And the honest question to them is, well, what are you going to offer them at the moment? Honestly, like, what do you think that you mentoring this founder kind of looks like? You've got to bring sort of something to the table, and that something could either be you've got the emotional intelligence that you've developed from working in a lot of different situations with a lot of different founders. You've got the practical experience of running a business. You've got the sort of industry knowledge of it, but it's not something that you can just kind of come in and just apply some intelligence to and sort of think you're going to spot things in their business that they haven't spotted. That's not what the role's about. The role is around helping them be as good as possible. It's not about getting to do the kind of fun bits of a business of coming in and sort of saying, oh, why aren't you doing this? Why aren't you doing that? And, oh, that would be a good idea. It's not about coming in and cherry picking some stuff that you think would be a good idea to try and then disappearing. It's about the founder. You have to check your ego and what you want to do at the door and think, well, what are they trying to do and how can I help them do that? And so you're looking for some evidence that someone's going to bring something to that conversation that's going to be really value add for that founder. And I think with what we do, you have to kind of go and accumulate some knowledge and experience and skills, which mean that you're going to bring something to the table in terms of helping that founder on their journey.
Frank, who do you ask for advice?
My team, got a really good team. We talk about things a lot. We generally sort of will collaborate on what the approach to a particular kind of problem or challenge might be. The founders in our portfolio, it's not a one-way conversation. Some of the best bits of support for some of our founders have been introducing them to another founder who's gone through a similar issue or went through a similar set of challenges and can sort of share their experience. So we try and kind of get that culture of learning from each other flowing between our portfolio companies, and also it's from our companies back into us, they're being side by side with them and hearing hearing about their experiences and their perspectives. It helps us become better. And then now I've got a few friends who have businesses which are totally unrelated to hospitality or drinks. And sometimes it's good to talk to them because you sort of identify some common challenges, but it may be that the approaches are sort of very different. And so having that sort of kind of learning from people who might be doing stuff in the entertainment industry or might be doing stuff in the software industry is really beneficial for me as well, I find, to kind of challenge yourself and make sure that you're bringing in kind of insights from different areas.
Yes. Obviously, there's a lot of team conversation taking place. How do you handle friction within that conversation?
I mean, friction sort of sounds like a kind of pejorative word. We definitely encourage different perspectives, and you can get comfortable with being different perspectives if there is two core things, I think. One is that we're all pretty clear in the direction we're headed in, so we're all fundamentally on the same journey. You know, you've got a problem if people are trying to achieve different things. That's not friction in terms of different views within the team. That's you've got a fundamental problem in that not everyone's sort of aligned and heading in the same direction, which is a different challenge. I think then the second key component is respect. If everyone around the table has got a kind of deep respect for the other people around the table and what they bring to it, you know, if someone you really respect is arguing a position which is fundamentally opposite to your position, if you respect them, it should give you pause to kind of say, well, what are they seeing that I'm not seeing, and challenges your own perspective. So I think if you've got those two elements, heading in the same direction and deep respect for each other, then having difference of views is really valuable because that often helps get to a much better collective view of what we should be doing.
Yes, and obviously I don't mean friction to sound like a bad thing. And from your answer there, you're describing it not to be a bad thing as well. Thank you, Frank. I'm going to wrap up with the last couple of questions. So I'd just like to know, ultimately, where do you see Distill Ventures? Where do you want it to be? What does success look like ultimately?
Yeah, I think success for us is really success of the brands that we work with. And we have enough brands with individual success that sort of kind of adds up to having an impact on the industry, really. So that's about sort of going into places around the world and sort of seeing a selection of our brands there and seeing that the brands that are interesting and talked about and the brands that bars want to kind of have and mixologists want to put in cocktails and that people want to buy at home, that our brands sort of start entering those lists, really. And we're lucky that we already kind of get that in many spaces. I think, you know, one of our first sort of big successes is something like Seedlip, which is not just a case of success for that brand in terms of seeing that in lots of different places around the world, but also huge success in terms of impacting the industry and making the industry take the idea of sort of hospitality for people as seriously when they're not drinking alcohol as when they are drinking alcohol, has been a real kind of game changer for the industry. And so that is the kind of success that we want to facilitate. And our success, I guess, is the aggregation of sort of seeing that happen, not just with sort of one brand and one category, but if we can see that happening with multiple brands across 2 or 3 categories over the next 10 years, then we'll feel like we've done a good job.
Beautiful. The last question for you, Frank, is who would you like to hear on the show?
That's a good question. Who would I like to hear on the show? I don't know about like specific names. I don't know. I think one of the things that really interests me when I come down to Australia is that you have got this phenomenal culinary and hospitality scene down there. And that is, I think, really interesting things which have kind of gone into kind of creating that. I think the way that the different immigrant communities into Australia have impacted that is clear to see. I think there's obviously been this sort of real discovery and use of Australian products and ingredients over the last few years. So I'm just sort of interested in sort of kind of what the next wave of that looks like. So I'm interested in people who see food for what it is, really, which is food is just a sort of kind of window into kind of culture, really. And so I'm really interested in people who are thinking about food as culture and how does our culture develop and our food develop at the same time, and what does that look like in terms of where people want to kind of go and eat and what they want to drink. So those are the types of conversations that really sort of fascinate me when you sort of elevate it from the, you know, I'm really interested in the practicalities of the industry and putting menus together and stuff, but I love it when you sort of get to kind of step back and sort of set that into a kind of broader cultural context of like, well, where are we going as a kind of country and what does that mean and how's that reflected in the kind of food that we make and share with each other.
Beautiful. I have some episodes to share with you after the episode, Frank. There are some guests where we've definitely traversed those sorts of conversations. So I'm glad you brought that up. Thank you very much for being on the show today. It's been incredible having you on, Frank.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
This program is hosted by James Henderson, with technical production by Jake Olver. Voiceovers were by Angus Brennan and Shim Phelan. Thanks to our distribution team, led by Stephanie Holland, and a special thanks to you for tuning in every week. This program was produced by H Media. We'll see you soon.